I'm pretty sure you've heard of each of the names that appear on screen. In fact, I'm also sure that at least one of these names is the deciding reason for your choice to consume a certain product, whether it be a film, a video game, a book, or a piece of music. Names have a substantially influential effect on our interest and expectations in a particular product. For example, seeing a name like Michael Bay or Adam Sandler makes us jump to the general assumption that it must be a bad thing because we're so used to identifying their name with lesser quality films, whereas a name like Leonardo DiCaprio or Martin Scorsese usually makes us associate with better cinema. Of course, that all depends on your taste in film. But this is without considering what the actual product is. Seeing a good name attached to a project can lead to unrealistically high expectations, which result in disappointment when the final product turns out to be inferior. Names are a valuable thing. Something as simple as a celebrity's autograph might be worth a lot of money, whereas a signature from a person of higher power can grant us access or enable us to do something. In fact, a name is now just as valuable, if not more so, than a company. Each of us can identify with Pixar or Marvel, but not as many identify with Happy Madison Productions. But we all know who Adam Sandler is, unfortunately. It seems so insignificant, but I find names and credits to be very fascinating as a manipulative tool that convinces us to consume something we believe has value. Names have always carried value, but in cinema especially, it became an essential marketing tool as film became a more mainstream pastime. In the silent era, names were rarely used because performers found film to be a challenging medium, and they felt it would hinder their credibility as primarily stage performers. There was also this fear from producers that performers would get so popular and demand higher salaries. It was when audiences began to recognize stars that it suddenly became clear that this was a tool for exploitation, as young talent were groomed, glamorized, and encouraged to take on personas to appeal to the public to help sell their films, because audiences flocked purely for them. The likes of Rock Hudson, Joan Crawford, and Marilyn Monroe all went through the same system, and everybody bought into their monumental status. For example, in the mid-50s, American teenagers could identify with James Dean and the characters he played because they represented the disillusionment and rebelliousness they felt. It's surprising to note that billing names has its own series of technicalities. Top billing is usually designated to actors who play the main characters, but this isn't always the case. The Godfather gave Marlon Brando top billing despite having a brief appearance in the film, and in that scenario, he also received above title billing because he was the most famous and marketable star in the entire film. Technically, Al Pacino, who at the time was a lesser known actor, should have received top billing because he was the film's main protagonist, and Brando should have received the last billing, or informally the "and" credit, which was basically for bigger actors in smaller roles. But it's a scenario like this that really shows the importance of star power, and it's all about how the audience perceive the position of their name. Sometimes films shamelessly promote their stars' accolades to give the perception of a higher quality production. Jamie Foxx actually requested top billing before Colin Farrell for Miami Vice because of his Oscar win for Ray, despite having a smaller role than Farrell. The name that comes first is always considered the leading star, and for advertisers, it's also the first name that audiences identify with. For example, when Ocean's 11 was marketed using an alphabetical system, Don Cheadle had his name removed from the credits because his surname preceded George Clooney, and producers didn't want Cheadle to have top billing over their most profitable star. But then finally, we even have names being used cleverly for narrative purposes. Director Alfred Hitchcock deliberately oversold actress Janet Leigh as the star of Psycho to make the mid-film twist even more shocking, which was later followed by the same marketing ploy used on Drew Barrymore in Scream, and even then both actresses were credited with last billing, so it wasn't necessarily deceptive by any means. As a film lover, it's always the director that stands out for me. Possessory credits became a pretty common practice after the 1970s, where credits like a film by Quentin Tarantino or Hitchcock's Frenzy solidified the creative vision of that particular director, and audiences could identify with their type of film. Quentin Tarantino is pretty confident in the value of his name to the point where he lets some directors add the banner Quentin Tarantino Presents on the promotional work of their films to add commercial viability to attract audiences who love Tarantino, despite Tarantino having no direct involvement in any of the productions other than his association with the directors. The Nightmare Before Christmas even caused the misconception that Tim Burton directed it because it's credited as Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. But the reasoning for this was not only the fact that Burton was the main creative voice behind the film, but the fact that his name had substantially more value than the film's actual director, Henry Selick, who I'd say is arguably better than Burton, just saying. In fact, Alfred Hitchcock even went as far as to make his own anthology series literally called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, marketed purely on the assumption that it would cater to those that enjoyed his work. Having the right name behind a project also helps stabilize concerns on big investments in particular films. In the last 15 years, adaptations are the growing standard in Hollywood because of two main reasons. Firstly, there's marketability in original popular material being translated into a profitable medium, and secondly, there is a new and undiscovered audience that it can reach to attract an even greater return on investment. I hate when people say Hollywood have ran out of ideas, because ideas are virtually endless. You will never run out of an idea. In fact, Woody Allen literally has a drawer full of them, but somebody neglected to tell him that they were all pretty much deviations of the same idea. But you see few original films making it to mainstream success because literally there is more risk and less reward, whereas with adaptations there is a general safety net that familiarity, things that people can identify with, can generate sizable audience figures. Of course, this isn't always the case, but when a new intellectual property is financed, producers are taking a risk that they want to ensure pays off royally, so having the right caliber behind it at least softens the threat of financial loss by marketing to broader audiences. For example, James Cameron made a substantial splash when he returned to the scene with the original film of Avatar in 2009, which went on to become the highest grossing film of all time, unfortunately. When the trailer for Avatar was released, it didn't hold back on Cameron's credentials. Every major beat of the final segment of the trailer is all of Cameron's most beloved and iconic work, almost as if it wants you to be excited about him. There was always this presence about Avatar that it wasn't the film that was being sold to us, it was James Cameron and his ambitious return to revolutionize cinema with new technology that wasn't actually all that new. But we believed it, and that's all that matters. Granted, there is something to be said about being an egomaniac that reminds you that he directed a film twice in the trailer, but when you see a director promote their film based on their name alone, that's because they are auteurs, the authors of their work, the creative visionary artists that use film as a means of self-expression. It's also a pretty effective marketing tool. In fact, a very good example of a name becoming marketable is the rise of Christopher Nolan. A film like Inception, which is an entirely new film that managed to obtain a high budget despite the risks involved and eventually became a box office sensation, banked on its talents such as Leonardo DiCaprio and even the heat behind Nolan following the success of The Dark Knight. In the trailer for Inception, they aren't banking on Christopher Nolan's name, they're banking on our identification with The Dark Knight. Then they solidify this with a hair-raising cut to black of DiCaprio's name to really provoke us and inspire our interest in seeing the film. Hence, this noise became a pretty distinct marketing tool because it helped heighten the impact of what were essentially a series of disconnected words. Following the success of Inception came The Dark Knight Rises, which didn't even use a name because it's Batman. They are confident that that'll sell it alone. But after 4 successful blockbusters, they include Nolan's name to Man of Steel, despite not even including it in the Dark Knight Rises trailers. This one is interesting because the studios aren't technically confident in Man of Steel for a number of reasons. One reason is that people don't identify with Man of Steel as they would Superman, hence when Batman vs Superman came out, the pretentious use of Man of Steel was nowhere to be seen. That film also banked on using Batman's name over Superman's despite it technically being Superman's film, so it's literally its own competitive top billing as well. This was likely down to the name sounding more fluid than Superman vs Batman, but Man of Steel didn't exactly make much of an impact, so confidence. This is a convoluted example of Hollywood's mentality. Batman has always been an incredibly profitable venture for financiers, whereas the Superman IP has never really gotten off the ground, no pun intended. So here we have an adaptation that people should be familiar with, but it's also a reboot that's technically its own original format, so there is still an inherent risk that it might not resonate or translate with audiences. So you have this obscure imbalance, a financially significant risk that they know is on shaky foundations, so there is a relief in establishing a comparison to films produced by a pedigree of talent. And bear in mind that Nolan is only one of 4 producers, but his name is far more familiar than the other 3. But when Nolan released his next big original film, it solidifies the value of his name. At first, it was the director of The Dark Knight, then it was Christopher Nolan, director of the Dark Knight trilogy, but in Interstellar, it's just from Christopher Nolan. At this point, after 5 consecutive commercial successes, there was a confidence that he can market his films in his own way because his name has become its own brand. And along with the signatures of other directors like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, or the Coen brothers, their consumers, their audience, can identify their products, their films. So they can keep producing original films on bigger budgets and market to mainstream media because there is an assurance that they have an audience willing to consume their latest products. On the outside, it seems so meaningless, but it's such a fascinating topic to explore, especially when you have people put very recognizable signatures on a film only for it to tank at the box office, which opens up this vacuum of uncertainty that sometimes audiences don't see the worth of a name. But then there are times when you just slap on any old name of somebody we all recognize and love and reap the rewards without any regard whatsoever for the consequences.